to think of your grandchildren as I think of mine, I'm not entirely sure whether to be pleased or alarmed.
Balmoral was meant to be quiet, a private royal stay, sealed behind stone walls, ancient customs, and the illusion of calm. But one opened piece of luggage changed everything. When a royal butler discovered a sacred heirloom hidden among Camilla's belongings, the silence inside the castle did not hold. It cracked, and in that crack, the monarchy saw something far more dangerous than scandal: betrayal inside its own walls. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The butler knew the weight of the room before anyone spoke. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish estate, where generations gathered away from the public eye, had been chosen for peace, not crisis. Senior figures had arrived under the promise of unity, tradition, and controlled calm. Charles wanted the stay to prove that the crown could still hold its family together. The king needed order. He needed dignity. He needed everyone to believe that behind the palace gates, the wounds were closing. Camilla did not expect a single suitcase to become the center of that wound. She watched as the butler's hand stopped inside the open luggage, his face losing color, before he carefully drew back. The queen consort saw the change in him before she saw what he had found. It was not a necklace. It was not a casual keepsake. It was the sealed mourning brooch, a sacred heirloom from the late queen's private Balmoral collection. A mourning brooch is a jewel kept in memory of someone who has died, and this one had been treated as more than jewelry. It belonged to grief. It belonged to legacy. Charles felt humiliation hit before anger could form. The brooch had never been meant to leave the estate without written royal authorization, meaning formal permission recorded by the household for protected royal items. The king understood what that meant. If the heirloom was inside Camilla's luggage, then either someone had moved it in secret, or someone had believed the rules no longer mattered. Neither answer was safe. Neither answer was small. The butler did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply folded the silk cloth back over the brooch, closed the case with quiet care, and asked for the household secretary. The household secretary is the senior palace official who manages private royal operations and records, and once that official was called, the discovery stopped being a personal embarrassment. It became a palace crisis. Camilla stood frozen as the room changed around her. Charles looked toward the closed case, then toward his wife, and the silence between them sharpened. The butler had exposed the object. The secretary would expose the trail. And before she could explain the brooch, the people closest to the crown began to understand that this was not just about an object, it was about trust. In royal crises, the first silence is always the loudest. Charles did not raise his voice. William did not rush into accusation. Camilla did not collapse into panic. Each person in that room understood the weight of what had been found, because the heirloom was not decoration. It carried memory, rank, grief, and ownership. And now, it sat between them like evidence no one could politely ignore. Charles stared at the closed case as if it had carried his mother's voice back into the room. The king saw the brooch not as a jewel, but as part of the late queen's guarded legacy, the private world she had left behind at Balmoral. A royal heirloom means an object passed through the family with deep symbolic value, and this one was tied to mourning, not display. That made its presence in Camilla's luggage feel like a wound placed directly on the table. William understood the danger faster than anyone expected. The prince knew Balmoral heirlooms were never casual possessions, because they carried family continuity, royal permission, and inherited responsibility. Balmoral was not only a holiday estate, it was the place where private grief had been protected from public hunger. If one sacred item could move without permission, then every promise around the late monarch's memory could suddenly look weak. Camilla felt the room turn toward her before anyone accused her. The queen consort kept her hands still, but her expression tightened between offense and fear. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say this was being twisted, before she had even been asked. But the brooch sat there, wrapped too carefully, hidden too neatly, and silence made her look more exposed than any confession could have done. William felt anger rise, but he held it down with visible effort. The future king knew one careless sentence could split the room in half. If he attacked Camilla, Charles would be forced to defend her. If he stayed silent, the brooch would speak for itself. So the prince chose restraint, and that restraint became more frightening than rage. He did not shout. He simply looked at the butler and asked him to describe exactly what he had found. The butler revealed the detail in a documented household account prepared for the secretary that same afternoon. He said the brooch had been wrapped in a silk cloth from the late queen's private rooms. That changed everything. The cloth meant the object had not simply fallen into the luggage. It had been handled with knowledge. It had been protected by someone who understood its value. Charles asked who had packed that section of the luggage, and the answer chilled the room. Camilla's closest dresser had not touched that compartment. The queen consort looked sharply toward the butler, then back to the king, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Someone had placed the heirloom there. Someone had moved through the private rooms. Someone had known enough to make the discovery look personal. The silence no longer belonged to shock. It belonged to suspicion. Attention shifted toward the locked corridor, the restricted cabinet, and the ugly possibility that the brooch had been removed before Camilla's luggage was ever brought downstairs. But to understand why one brooch could wound so deeply, the family had to look back to the moment that made the heirloom untouchable. Long before the luggage was opened, the brooch had already become more than gold, stone, and royal history. It had become a promise. A private ceremony at Balmoral had transformed it into a symbol of loyalty to the late queen's memory. Those who stood in that room knew it was never meant to be used for personal advantage, and one particular moment made that rule impossible to forget. Charles remembered the day with a heaviness he could not escape. The king had stood inside the Balmoral library after his mother's final summer, holding the case as if it carried the last warmth of her hand. The private collection meant personal royal items kept away from public display, not for museums or ceremonies, but for family memory. That was why the brooch mattered. It was not a prize. It was not decoration. It was grief made permanent. William had been there too, and the prince had not forgotten a single word. The future king remembered how quiet the room became when the case was placed before the family. Balmoral had already been heavy with absence, because every corridor seemed to carry the late queen's shadow. That ceremony was meant to protect what she left behind. It gave the family a way to honor her without turning her memory into palace currency. Camilla stood beside Charles that day, composed and careful, but the queen consort felt the invisible wall around the moment. She was present, yet not fully inside the grief. She watched father and son move around the queen's memory with a tenderness that did not easily include her. That distance stayed with her. It became one of those quiet wounds no one names, but everyone feels when silence stretches too long. Charles touched the case and made the promise softly. He said certain personal items would remain protected from politics, preference, or palace rivalry. The Balmoral Library Remembrance Ceremony, a private family gathering held to honor the late monarch's memory, became the trigger everyone later looked back on. It was the point where the brooch stopped being only an heirloom and became a test of loyalty. William heard the vow clearly. The prince watched his father declare that the brooch would never be removed without family agreement, meaning no single person could take it, use it, or move it for private reasons. That mattered, because royal families survive on rules that are often unspoken but deeply understood. Break one of those rules, and the wound is not only legal, it becomes personal. Camilla had lowered her eyes when Charles spoke, and the queen consort had remained still. No one accused her of wanting the brooch. No one imagined that one day it would be found inside her luggage. But the memory of her standing there now returned with brutal force. She had heard the vow. She had witnessed the boundary. She knew what that case meant. The brooch was sealed after the ceremony in a restricted cabinet, a locked storage place where only approved household figures could access sensitive royal objects. That detail made the luggage discovery impossible to soften. It could not be brushed aside as confusion. It could not be explained as careless packing. Someone had crossed a line that had been drawn in grief. William felt that old promise harden inside him. The future king no longer saw only a hidden brooch. He saw his father's vow being tested, his grandmother's memory being disturbed, and Camilla standing too close to a breach that could damage them all. The discovery was painful, but the memory of that ceremony made it unforgivable, and he was the first to say so aloud. The confrontation did not happen before the household. It happened behind a closed door, where royal voices could drop low and still cut like steel. William entered first, controlled but visibly shaken. Charles followed, older in that moment than he had seemed all week. Camilla stood near the table, refusing to sit. The brooch rested between them, and the room waited for one question that could not be avoided. Charles ordered the room cleared, before concern could become procedure. The king knew that once aides began writing notes and passing messages, a family wound would turn into a palace file. Palace procedure means the formal process used when royal staff record, review, and manage sensitive matters. And he wanted to stop that machinery for as long as he could. He wanted privacy. He wanted control. Most of all, he wanted one honest answer before the crown had to protect itself from its own people. William did not let the silence protect anyone. The prince looked at the brooch, then at Camilla, and asked why it had been found inside her luggage. He spoke calmly, but the calmness made the question heavier. He knew the heirloom's protected status meant it belonged first to family memory before it belonged to any office or title. If the matter reached officials before the family faced it, the damage would become colder, harder, and impossible to soften. Camilla felt the question close around her. The queen consort lifted her chin, pride rushing in to cover fear, and said she had believed the brooch had been set aside for review. Her voice did not break. Her hands did not shake. But the defense landed badly, because review required authorization, and authorization meant a written approval logged before any protected item moved. No such approval existed. William challenged the explanation at once. The future king did not raise his voice, yet every word struck harder than shouting. He reminded Charles that the Balmoral vow had not been symbolic theater. It had been a promise. The prince knew that if the brooch could be moved under the excuse of review, then every guarded object connected to the late queen could be pulled into private preference. That was not sentiment. That was danger. Charles turned toward his wife, torn in a way everyone could feel. The king wanted to protect Camilla from humiliation, but he also remembered touching that case during the remembrance ceremony. He remembered promising that certain items would never become weapons inside palace life. His marriage pulled one way. His mother's memory pulled another, and between them sat the brooch, silent and merciless. The butler returned when Charles asked for him. In a signed household statement prepared that evening, the servant confirmed the compartment had been fastened, wrapped, and placed with deliberate care. He said the brooch had not been tossed into the luggage by mistake. It had been hidden neatly, almost respectfully, as if someone wanted it protected but unseen. Camilla heard the words and turned pale, because the detail made innocence harder to prove. Charles made the first hard decision before anyone else could speak. The king ordered the brooch removed from Camilla's possession and returned to secure custody immediately. Secure custody means protected royal storage, where access is controlled and recorded. The queen consort stared at him as if the order had struck her personally. William lowered his eyes, not in victory, but in grim relief. That single order changed the air in Balmoral, because it proved Charles would not bury the matter simply to spare her pride. In monarchy, Power rarely arrives with noise. It arrives with a folder placed on a table, a name spoken carefully, a signature withheld. After the confrontation, Charles faced a decision that cut through marriage, memory, and succession. The brooch had to be protected, but so did the crown. And for the first time that day, everyone understood that emotional damage could become constitutional danger if handled poorly. Charles sat with the custody note in front of him and did not touch the pen. The king understood that private royal heirlooms tied to Balmoral could not move by feeling, favor, or family pressure. A custody note is a written record explaining where a protected royal item is kept, who can access it, and why it may be moved. That note mattered because the brooch was no longer only a symbol of mourning. It had become proof that someone near the heart of the household had crossed a guarded line. The household secretary explained the rule with careful words. The official said documented permission was required before any private heirloom could be removed for personal use, review, or tribute. Documented permission means a clear written approval kept in palace records, so no one can later pretend the movement was casual. Charles heard the explanation and looked older with every sentence, because the rule left very little room for comfort. Either the system had failed, or someone had stepped around it. William's objection carried weight, even when he was not in the room. The prince was not yet king, but his future role made his warning impossible to ignore. Charles held immediate authority over the brooch, yet William represented the next chapter of the crown. If the future king believed the late queen's memory had been mishandled, then this was not just a private argument. It was a warning about inheritance, trust, and the shape of the monarchy after Charles. Camilla waited elsewhere, angry and wounded. The queen consort knew decisions were being made while her voice had lost control of the room. She had entered Balmoral as a senior royal figure, but now she was being discussed like a risk that needed managing. That realization cut deeper than any accusation. She could defend herself against words. She could not defend herself against a process already moving without her. Charles finally picked up the custody note, read it again, and set it down without speaking. The king wanted duty to feel clean, but it did not. It felt brutal. Protecting the brooch meant protecting his mother's memory, but it also meant allowing Camilla to feel publicly trusted while privately restricted. The monarch saw the cost clearly. Comfort would please his wife. Duty would steady the crown. He could not have both. The custody log turned the room colder. It showed that the restricted cabinet had been accessed during the Balmoral stay, but the entry did not clearly name who requested the removal. A custody log is the official record of when a protected item is opened, handled, or moved. That missing name changed suspicion into something sharper. It meant the brooch had not simply appeared in Camilla's luggage. A path existed. Someone had walked it. A palace aide admitted through a recorded internal conversation that the brooch had been discussed days earlier as part of a private tribute. The aide said the idea had been raised quietly, almost delicately, but never formally approved. Charles heard the admission and closed his eyes for a moment. Camilla's anger now had a shadow behind it. Maybe she had expected honor. Maybe someone had promised more than they had the power to give. Charles signed the temporary restriction order before doubt could weaken him. A restriction order is a written command limiting access until a sensitive matter is reviewed. The king's signature moved the monarchy from shock to control, and that control carried consequences. Camilla would be told she could no longer access the private collection. The brooch would return to protected custody. And the queen consort was about to feel, in the most personal way, what it meant to be inside the crown, but not above its rules. The first consequence was not public. It was not a headline, not a statement, not a palace leak. It was a closed door, and Camilla sitting alone after being told the restriction had already been signed. The queen consort did not weep at first. She stared at the empty chair across from her, understanding that the family had not merely questioned her explanation. They had limited her access. Camilla heard the decision in words so calm they felt colder than accusation. The private Balmoral heirlooms connected to the late queen would be placed under reviewed custody until the matter was resolved. Reviewed custody means protected storage, where every movement, request, and approval is checked before anyone can touch the item again. That mattered because the brooch was no longer treated as a family keepsake. It had become evidence of a breach. Charles allowed the restriction to stand because reversing it would make the family's promise look meaningless. The king knew the late queen's memory had already been pulled into the center of the crisis. If he softened the order too quickly, William would see weakness, the household would see confusion, and Camilla's critics would see protection. So he chose the rule. He chose the record. He chose the crown, even as his wife sat on the other side of that choice. Camilla felt humiliated by the quiet formality of it all. The queen consort had not been publicly accused, yet trust had clearly moved away from her. No one shouted her name. No one demanded a confession. That almost made it worse. A loud attack could be answered. A silent restriction could only be endured. She had entered Balmoral as the king's wife, but now she felt like someone being watched from behind polite faces. Charles stepped into the room later, and the distance between them widened before he spoke. The king saw the hurt in Camilla's face, but he also saw the brooch in his mind, sealed back inside royal control. She asked him whether he believed her. He opened his mouth, then paused too long. That pause became its own answer. Not guilt, not innocence, something worse. Doubt. Camilla turned away from him, wounded more deeply by the hesitation than by the order itself. The queen consort had survived judgment before, but this judgment came from inside the marriage. Charles tried to explain that the restriction protected everyone until the truth was clear. She heard only that he could not defend her without proof. The king reached for comfort, but duty had already taken the place where comfort should have been. The dresser's timeline made the wound darker. In a documented household account, the dresser stated that Camilla's luggage had been left unattended for 11 minutes near the private corridor before departure checks began. A private corridor means a restricted passage used by household staff and senior royals, away from ordinary guest movement. 11 minutes was not long, but in a royal house, 11 unattended minutes can change history. The butler then remembered something he had not placed at the center of his first statement. In a recorded follow-up conversation with the household secretary, he said he had seen a familiar palace aide leave that same corridor with his head down. The butler could not prove what the aide had done. Still, the memory opened a second thread of responsibility. Camilla was no longer the only question. Someone else might have moved the brooch before it ever reached her case. William heard the update and asked to speak with Charles without aides present. The prince understood that paperwork could control the brooch, but it could not heal the damage. The future king wanted the matter faced as family before it hardened into institutional punishment. But the next shift did not come from records, timelines, or household rules. It came from a father and son facing each other, without anyone left to soften the truth. There were no secretaries in the room this time, no footmen, no advisors, only Charles and William, two men standing on opposite sides of grief, duty, and the future. The brooch had forced them into a conversation neither wanted, because it was no longer enough to ask how the heirloom moved. They had to decide what kind of monarchy would survive after the answer. Charles met William privately, because the matter had moved beyond household discipline. The king understood that discipline meant correcting a breach, but trust meant repairing what the breach had exposed. Royal inheritance is not only money or jewels. It is the passing of duty, memory, and authority from one generation to the next. That was why this moment mattered. The brooch had become a test of whether the family could protect the late queen's legacy without destroying one another. William entered the conversation with anger under control, but not gone. The prince believed the protected objects connected to the late queen had to remain symbols of continuity, not bargaining pieces inside private tensions. Continuity means the monarchy's sense of unbroken duty from one reign to the next, and he knew that if sacred items could be moved for personal reasons, the whole idea of inherited responsibility would feel hollow. The future king was not defending a jewel, he was defending the line it represented. Charles admitted what he had avoided saying in front of everyone else. The king feared humiliating Camilla. He feared letting the world see his wife treated as though she had crossed a line she could never fully step back from. He told William that public accusation would bruise the crown and wound his marriage at the same time. For a moment, he sounded less like a monarch and more like a husband trapped between loyalty and law. William softened when he saw his father's exhaustion. The prince knew Charles was not trying to excuse the breach. He was trying to survive it. But softness did not make him retreat. William told him that protecting memory was not the same as punishing Camilla. The future king said the family could avoid public cruelty while still setting firm boundaries. If the brooch returned quietly, the wound might close. If the rules bent quietly, the wound would spread. Charles then revealed his decision through a recorded private conversation kept in the family file. The king would not accuse Camilla publicly. He would not allow the matter to become a staged humiliation, but he would permanently change access rules around private royal heirlooms. Access rules are the limits deciding who can request, handle, or move protected family objects. From that moment forward, no single household figure, no senior royal, and no private office could move such an item without approval. William accepted only when Charles agreed to one final condition. The brooch would return to the Balmoral Memorial Cabinet under joint oversight. Joint oversight means more than one trusted authority must approve and record any future movement. The prince needed that safeguard because trust had already failed once. He did not want another quiet corridor, another vague request, another object appearing where it should never have been. Charles nodded, and the decision settled between them with painful calm. The king had chosen containment over destruction, but containment was not forgiveness. William had chosen restraint over public judgment, but restraint was not surrender. Both men knew Camilla would feel the decision as a loss, even without hearing an accusation. Both also knew the late queen's memory had been protected by drawing a line no one could cross again. The private choice became the foundation of the palace response. Inside Balmoral, the family had chosen control, custody, and silence. Outside its walls, however, silence was already failing. Whispers had found their way beyond the estate. The image of a hidden brooch, a sealed suitcase, and a butler's discovery had become too powerful to contain. Inside Balmoral, the family had chosen containment. Outside its walls, the world was already preparing to turn the hidden brooch into a national symbol. By morning, the story was no longer confined to Balmoral corridors. It had reached breakfast tables, phone screens, radio studios, and the iron gates where royal watchers gathered in uneasy clusters. The palace tried to shape the message, but the image had already taken hold. A sacred heirloom, a queen consort's luggage, and a butler brave enough to expose what others might have hidden. Charles understood the danger the moment the statement was prepared. The palace released a careful line saying a private family heirloom had been returned to secure custody after an internal review. An internal review means a private examination carried out inside the royal household before any public explanation is given. That wording mattered because it admitted something had happened, without naming blame. It protected Camilla from direct accusation, but it also confirmed that the brooch had been moved, found, and taken back under control. Camilla watched the coverage in silence, and every sentence seemed to attach itself to her name. The queen consort had not been charged, shamed, or formally blamed, yet the story had already made her the center of suspicion. She heard presenters repeat the phrase, "her luggage," and each time, it felt less like a detail and more like a verdict. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted someone to say the question was bigger than her, But the world had chosen its image, and that image was brutal. Charles felt the old terror of royal scandal return. The king had survived storms before, but this one reached into two sacred places at once: his marriage and his mother's memory. He knew the public understood more than the statement said. People could hear the silence around Camilla. They could sense William's pressure without seeing him. They could feel that a protected heirloom had become a test of whether the crown still had discipline inside its own walls. The front page turned the crisis into something unforgettable. A London newspaper printed a black velvet jewelry case beneath the headline, "The brooch in the bag." The phrase spread within hours. It was simple, sharp, and impossible to soften. The image mattered because it gave the public one object to hold on to. Not a policy, not a palace process. A brooch, a bag, a secret that had escaped. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates as broadcasters framed the moment in heavy words. One presenter called it, "The day private grief became public judgment," and the line cut through the noise. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's official London residence, the place the public associates with royal authority. So the crowd there made the Balmoral crisis feel national. People were not only asking what Camilla knew, they were asking whether the family could still protect its own symbols. William heard the broadcast and said nothing at first. The prince knew public pressure could either force truth or distort it. He did not want spectacle. He wanted boundaries. The future king understood that if the story became only about Camilla's embarrassment, the real lesson would be lost. The brooch mattered because it represented duty, memory, and trust. Without those, the monarchy became decoration, with no moral weight behind it. Camilla remained still, as the coverage grew louder. The queen consort had spent years fighting to be seen as steady, loyal, and necessary. Now one hidden heirloom threatened to reduce her place in the family to a single question mark. Charles saw that pain, but he also saw the pressure building beyond the gates. The king could not undo the front page. He could only decide what the final internal record would say. Public fascination made the scandal louder, but it also forced clarity. Charles knew silence could no longer carry the whole burden. The family needed closure, not revenge. The crown needed a verdict, not another pause. And the final meaning of the moment would be decided behind palace doors, where the king had one last choice to make. The ending came without spectacle. No balcony, no grand speech, no dramatic punishment staged for the world. The brooch was returned to the Balmoral memorial cabinet, placed back where the late queen's memory had first been sealed. Charles stood before it in silence. William watched beside him. Camilla remained absent, and in that absence the monarchy delivered its real verdict. Charles confirmed the final order with a voice that carried no triumph. The king declared the brooch would remain permanently under restricted family custody, with every future request recorded and approved before movement. Restricted family custody means protected control by selected family authorities, not open access for personal use or quiet borrowing. That mattered because the heirloom had already been pulled too close to suspicion. If the crown allowed uncertainty to survive, the late queen's memory would remain vulnerable to whispers, pressure, and private ambition. William accepted the decision because it protected what the family could not afford to lose. The prince did not want public destruction. He wanted permanence. The future king understood that the brooch was more than a jewel returned to a cabinet. It was a line redrawn after trust had been shaken. By agreeing with Charles, he allowed the crisis to end without spectacle. But he also made sure the lesson could not be quietly erased. Camilla remained absent from the final return, and that absence said more than any speech. The queen consort was not stripped of dignity. She was not publicly accused. She was not pushed into open shame, but she was quietly separated from the private collection that had once suggested acceptance into the deepest royal circle. That separation became the real consequence. She still belonged beside the king, but she no longer stood close to every protected memory. Charles carried that sadness heavily. The monarch had protected Camilla from public accusation, but he could not protect her from consequence. He had chosen not to make his wife a public symbol of blame, yet he had also signed the order that changed her access forever. The king knew mercy had limits when memory was at stake. Love could soften the language. It could not erase the breach. The final internal record ended the last attempt to soften what had happened. In a documented palace account, the entry stated that the heirloom's placement in the luggage was unauthorized, regardless of intention. Unauthorized means done without official permission, even if someone believed there was a private reason behind it. That one word closed the door. It did not need to accuse Camilla directly. It simply made the movement of the brooch impossible to defend. The butler was privately thanked for acting with discretion. In a short recorded meeting with the household secretary, he was told that loyalty to the crown sometimes means stopping the powerful before silence becomes damage. The butler had not shouted. He had not sold the moment. He had simply refused to ignore what he found. And because of that restraint, the monarchy was forced to face itself. The discovery did not destroy the monarchy. It clarified it. Balmoral's heirloom reminded everyone that royal power survives only when memory, duty, and trust are stronger than personal desire. Charles learned that protection can still wound. William learned that restraint can still command. Camilla learned that belonging to the royal family is not the same as being trusted with everything it holds sacred. There was no further mystery left to solve, only the lasting truth that one hidden brooch exposed the fragile line between being inside the monarchy and being trusted by it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.